When most people think of William Wallace's death, they picture Mel Gibson's tear-streaked face screaming, "Freedom," in Braveheart. But that cinematic moment is a sanitized version of a much darker truth. Wallace didn't just die, he was destroyed. After leading a fierce rebellion against English rule, he was captured, labeled a traitor, and sentenced to one of the most gruesome executions in recorded history. The real story isn't just about justice, it's about sending a message. England didn't want to kill Wallace. They wanted to erase him. But their brutality had the opposite effect. William Wallace was a Scottish knight and freedom fighter born around 1270 in Elderslie, Renfrewshire, Scotland. He emerged as one of the key leaders during the wars of Scottish independence against England. At the end of the 13th century, Scotland teetered between independence and domination. Following the death of King Alexander III and his heir, Scotland was plunged into a succession crisis. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, saw a chance to tighten his grip, treating Scotland not as an ally but as a rebellious province. Amid this turmoil rose William Wallace, not a high-born noble, but a minor landowner driven by grief and rage. After his family suffered under English occupation, Wallace struck back, famously defeating English forces at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. That victory proved Scottish resistance wasn't just symbolic, it was potent. But Edward, no stranger to stamping out rebellion, viewed Wallace's defiance as a direct threat to his authority. As he had done in Wales and with England's Jewish population, he responded with merciless precision. Wallace's rise marked the beginning of an English campaign of vengeance. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had submitted to English rule, leaving Wallace isolated. His continued resistance embarrassed both the English crown and his fellow Scots. His capture became inevitable, betrayed, likely by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had sided with England. Wallace was seized near Glasgow. Chained and degraded, he was dragged to London, paraded through towns like a trophy. His trial at Westminster Hall on August 23rd was a spectacle, conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't understand. The charges were severe: treason, murder, sacrilege. When asked to answer for treason, Wallace famously declared he owed no allegiance to Edward I, having never sworn fealty to him. His defiance only sealed his fate. The outcome had been decided long before he entered the courtroom. The trial existed not to determine guilt, but to legitimize an already chosen punishment. It was theater, meant to justify horror with the facade of law. The sentence passed down was the most brutal available: hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved for traitors. Wallace's execution wasn't about ending a life. It was about annihilating a symbol. On the morning of August 23rd, he was stripped and bound to a wooden hurdle. Dragged through the filthy streets of London, his body was battered by cobblestones as the jeering crowd pelted him with refuse. At Smithfield, the city's execution ground, a scaffold stood waiting. There, the real horror began. First, he was hanged, but not until death. As he began to lose consciousness, the executioner cut him down. Next came emasculation and disembowelment, while Wallace was still alive. His intestines were pulled from his body and burned before his eyes. The crowd was silent as his screams pierced the air. Finally, he was beheaded. His body was then quartered, each limb sent to a different city as a warning. His head, dipped in tar, was mounted on London Bridge. Every step of the execution was symbolic. The drawing signified his removal from civil society, the hanging, his spiritual rejection, the disemboweling, his moral corruption, and the quartering, his total obliteration. Wallace's death was not punishment. It was public psychological warfare. Wallace's execution wasn't conducted in secret. It was a public holiday. Thousands gathered, not just to witness justice, but to revel in it. Vendors sold food and drinks. Families brought children. The execution was transformed into entertainment, complete with cheering crowds and official encouragement. Wallace was turned from a man into a symbol, a spectacle of royal dominance. The slow procession through London allowed time for emotions to fester. The English crown knew well that fear is most effective when it's shared. By making Wallace's suffering communal, they ensured its memory would linger. The jeers, the silence during his mutilation, and the collective gaze of a society witnessing the depths of cruelty. It was a ritual of control. This wasn't just about punishing Wallace. It was about making the audience complicit. Every scream and every cheer drove home a single truth. This is what happens when you challenge the might of a king. Edward I believed that executing Wallace would crush all resistance. And at first, it did. It terrified many into silence. But in the end, it had the opposite effect. Wallace became a martyr. His death, so cruel, so public, lit a fire in the hearts of those who still believed in independence. One of those hearts belonged to Robert the Bruce. Witnessing Wallace's brutal fate only strengthened his resolve. Just 9 years later, Bruce would lead Scotland to a decisive victory at Bannockburn, a turning point in the Wars of Independence. Wallace's execution taught the Scots a hard truth. Surrender brought humiliation, not mercy. Fighters began to believe it was better to die in battle than face the scaffold. The plan to erase Wallace failed completely. Instead of killing the idea of freedom, Edward's cruelty gave it a face, a voice, a martyr whose memory would never die. Wallace's death echoed far beyond his own time. Over centuries, his story became part of debates about justice, cruelty, and human dignity. Legal scholars would later point to his execution as proof of government overreach, punishment stripped of any humanity. The horror of it helped shape ideas about human rights and how prisoners should be treated. Culturally, Wallace became a folk hero. His story passed from bard to book to screen, each generation finding new meaning in his sacrifice. Even though Hollywood softened the details, the truth is more powerful. Wallace's legacy shaped Scottish identity, embedding resilience and resistance deep into the national spirit. He became a symbol far beyond Scotland itself, a reminder that true power doesn't come from fear, but from conviction. Wallace lost his life, but he gained immortality. In death, he became exactly what Edward I feared most, an idea too strong to be silenced. William Wallace's execution wasn't just the end of a man, it was a message, carved in blood and pain. Edward meant to erase a rebel. Instead, he created a legend. The agony Wallace endured reminds us that freedom is never simply given. It must be wrestled from the grip of tyranny, often at a terrible cost. In our modern world, it's easy to forget the horrors that built our liberties. Wallace's suffering forces us to remember. His silence in pain, his refusal to bend, they weren't just acts of defiance. They were declarations that some ideals are worth dying for. If you found this deep dive into William Wallace's final days both shocking and enlightening, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories from history that go beyond the myths. Drop a comment below. What legend should we uncover next? Thanks for watching,